What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video. This video was actually meant to be released yesterday, but upon editing it, I realized that the entire thing was completely out of focus. So here we are, re-recording it, doing it over again, and hopefully this time it works out nicely. So the topic of this video is going to be the settings that I use in camera, the features that I employ to actually make the filming process a lot more streamlined and simplified. And yeah, let's get into it. So I am currently shooting on the Sony A7S III. So for the picture profile, I always shoot in S-Log3, and then for the color mode, it's A7Siii. I find that this provides the best quality image from this camera, and it gives me the flexibility that I need in post to actually color grade the footage and implement the look, the desired look that I want to achieve for that given shoot. Obviously, there's certain scenarios when it might be more practical to shoot in, Rec 709 or something where where you're not wanting to do as much post-production work. But for me personally, I enjoy the process of color grading, so I like to shoot in S-Log3. I'm not going to show you how to actually set that up on the camera just because there's plenty of tutorials out there already, but I just thought I'd go over what picture profile I shoot in. So then what I want to do is I want to move on to talking about how to properly expose with S-Log3. So for me personally, what I found that's worked is to overexpose by about 1 to 2 stops. Obviously there's going to be people who say differently on the internet, but this is what has worked for me personally. Obviously you can play around, see what works for you, but I like to do about 1 to 2 stops depending on it. And that being said, when you're looking at your little LCD screen on the camera itself, the meter might say that the shot is, let's say, over 2 stops overexposed, but in reality, you don't know what the meter's actually pulling that information from. So chances are it's actually pulling it from the highlights region of the shot, and it's not factoring in maybe what the shadows are expressing. So the shadows could potentially be, 1 stop underexposed, who knows? And so for me, that's why I personally think it's very crucial to utilize the zebra feature of your camera. So what I like to do is I like to set the zebras on my camera to a value of about 75. And so this will give you a general idea of when your skin tones are properly exposed. The last thing you want is to have your skin tones completely blown out and there be no detail left in them. It kind of gives that like alien reptile look where, the skin is gray and there's no color to it, no detail. So setting a value for your zebras of about 75 will ensure that your skin tones are properly exposed and you'll retain the detail in them. So what I find is that I personally can't just use the LCD screen. I love to have an external monitor as well. And I would highly recommend everyone to get an external monitor if you don't have one. There's a lot of cheap options out there, but they just provide a lot of additional features that can significantly help you when it comes to properly exposing your shots. And so what I like to do is I like to set the zebras on my external monitor to a value of about 90%. And so this will basically indicate when my highlights are properly exposed as well. So it'll ensure that I'm not completely blowing out my highlights and that I have a nice image where, you're not losing all the information in the highlights, and as well as you're retaining, the information in the skin tones. So it gives you that flexibility to both see the skin tone exposure as well as on your external monitor, the highlight exposure. I think it's very crucial to know in advance prior to going into your shoot what sort of look you're wanting to go for each shot. And by utilizing the features of your camera with the zebras and the external monitor with the zebras, this will allow you to achieve that look, whether it be completely crushing the shadows to retain detail in the highlights, or maybe blowing out some of the highlights to then retain some of the detail in the shadows. You should have a general idea of what you're looking to achieve prior to actually going in the shoot, because the worst thing to do is, let's say, crush the shadows when you're out there shooting and then try to pull back some information in post, a lot of the time this is almost impossible and it'll result in a very noisy image. And sure, you can reduce some of the noise in post, but the image just isn't gonna look as good as if you were to properly expose it when you're actually shooting. So just take the time to think through what look you're going for, and then this will help you a lot, make everything smoother when you're actually out there filming. So another thing that I wanted to briefly touch on is the native ISO. So what I love about the A7S III is that it actually has a dual native ISO. So it's 640 and 12,800. And this makes this camera very versatile for when you're shooting in both bright scenarios as well as low light scenarios. So that's a big range in ISO. And I've personally found this extremely beneficial for a lot of my shoots. A lot of my shoots have been more run and gun style shoots, so I don't have necessarily the ability to bring a lot of lights around with me and set them up and ensure that I can use an ISO of 640. So some scenarios require me to bump the ISO up to 12,800, and that's no problem with this camera. So you still retain a really good quality image. I wouldn't recommend any other ISO in between the native ISOs, just because I've found personally that a lot of these tend to result in a really noisy image. And like I said before, that's not what you want. That's gonna make your life miserable. So just try to stick with the native ISO. And I remember when I was first starting out, I struggled to understand how then to properly expose my shot if I were to bump the ISO up to 12,800, because obviously that's providing a lot more stops of exposure. So what I initially thought was acceptable would be to crank the aperture and try to compensate with that and bring down my exposure by a couple stops. But the issue with cranking the aperture is that it's gonna then depreciate from the actual look that you're wanting to achieve. So if you're wanting to achieve a quote unquote cinematic look and you have your aperture set to f4, then if you were to then crank your aperture to, let's say, f18, that's going to completely take away from that look that you're wanting to achieve, because then there'll no longer be that nice depth of field where your subject is separated from its background, and everything will kind of blend into one flat image. So instead of relying on using the aperture to help you get the desired exposure, instead, what I would highly recommend is to get a variable ND filter. So variable ND filters not only help you get the proper exposure, but they also make your image look a lot nicer too. I would highly recommend getting one. It's gonna save you a lot of headaches, and it's gonna make life so much easier. You can get a screw-on one that goes onto your lens, or you could get a matte box that then has an insert variable ND filter. It's really personal preference, but highly recommend a variable ND filter to help you achieve the correct exposure that you're going for. So to quickly recap what I've covered, so basically I shoot in S-Log3 with a color mode of S-Gamut3 that provides for me the best quality image. I like to utilize the zebra features on both the LCD screen of the camera as well as my external monitor. So I'll set the zebras on my external monitor to about 90% for highlights, and then on the LCD screen of the camera I'll set it to about 75 for proper exposure of skin tones. And then in regards to ISO, try to stick with the native ISO of your camera. So for this instance, mine is 640 and 12,800. So figure out what your native ISO is for your camera and then stick to that. And then use a variable ND filter to help you achieve the proper exposure. So then I had another question come up in the comments about how I cut my clips to actually make it seamless and aesthetic, essentially. So obviously, when you're making any sort of video, you want it to flow nicely. You don't want it to be jarring for the audience. You want them to be able to comfortably follow along throughout the video and not have to wonder what's going on at any given point. You don't want to cause confusion based on how you cut your footage, unless for some reason that's the intention of the video. But for the most part, you want the viewer to be able to follow what's going on and it to make sense. So what I find, especially for sports related content, is that I love to follow the motion of the athlete and cut based on that. So for instance, in the video that I shot with the Ironman athlete, when he was swimming and doing the front crawl, I would, let's say, let one clip run until his right arm comes out of the water, and then I would cut it there. And then the following clip that's at a different focal length, I would then start it where his right arm is out of the water and ready to go back in. So if that makes sense, I like to make the movement flow as it normally would. I find that if you were to cut one clip where his right arm's coming out of the water and then start the next clip where his left arm is going into the water, it kind of causes a bit of confusion and it doesn't flow quite as seamlessly. Also, I would highly recommend looking into learning about different cuts, so like match cuts, all those sorts of things. I'm not going to really go over them in detail right now. These are other things that you can implement in your edit to actually ensure that it flows a lot smoother and it's a lot more visually appealing. So another thing that you can consider as well is using audio to help the transition of clips. So I'll go into this in a little bit more detail in my next video where I go over the post-production and my color grading. But basically you can utilize audio from clips or additional sound effects that you find online to actually help with the transition. It smooths out the transition a lot and makes it a lot more natural. So that's all I'm gonna cover right now in regards to how I cut my clips down and how I format my timeline. I can dive deeper into that in my next video when I'm focusing on the color grading aspect and the post-production aspect. But for now, we'll leave it at that. That's a little snippet of information there. I don't wanna make this video too long. Last one was really long, so I'm trying to cut it a little shorter. But yeah, so thank you guys for commenting on previous videos, asking questions. I really appreciate that. One of the main reasons why I wanted to start this channel is to create a community for young filmmakers who basically are learning together and want to just achieve greater things together and share information. So keep commenting on videos, and next video, yeah, will be more of the post-production and the color grading side of things. Obviously, I'm no expert by any means, so I'm still learning, but I'll go into my color grading process in DaVinci Resolve. If that's of interest to you, then stay tuned for next week's video. But thank you guys for tuning in. Thanks for the support. I appreciate you guys. Hope you're having a great day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.